Bon dia. Benvingudes i benvinguts al Congrés Internacional C25 d'Arts i Humanitats per al Benestar i la Inclusió. El meu nom és Verónica Hurtado, jo formo part de la Càtedra de Salut Mental de la Universitat de Catalunya, Universitat Central de Catalunya. Anirem veient a mi durant el llarg del dia que us faré una mica d'enllaç amb les presentacions dels diferents ponents que tindrem avui durant la jornada. En aquest sentit, per mi és un plaer presentar el senyor Xavier Fina, director general de Promoció Cultural i Biblioteques de la Generalitat de Catalunya, que presentarà seguidament el senyor Christopher Bailey, responsable d'Arts and Health de l'Organització Mundial de la Salut. Moltes gràcies.
No patiu que no parlaré ara, ja he parlat prou. Només presento. El senyor Christopher Bailey és el responsable, com s'ha dit, d'Arts i Salut de l'Organització Mundial de la Salut i vull assenyalar només dos elements. En primer lloc, d'això que hem estat parlant, d'aquesta novetat, hi ha un text que en podríem dir fundacional, o hi ha un informe fundacional, tot i que no és... Ja hi havia una tradició, però en el moment que hi ha un abans i un després és quan l'Organització Mundial de la Salut, el 2019, publica un article en el qual el senyor Bailey hi va tenir un protagonisme molt important. El senyor Bailey s'incorpora el 2017 i aquest article és del 2019, aquest informe és del 2019 i és un document, un informe amb el qual allò que deia abans de la fe i el coneixement, quan el vam descobrir, els que teníem aquesta fe, ens el vam posar a la carpeta i quan algú tenia dubtes l'ensenyàvem i dèiem l'OMS ho diu. No és que ho digui l'UNESCO, no és que ho digui la UNESCO, que ja li toca dir-ho, sinó que ho diu l'OMS amb tot el prestigi. En aquest sentit, fa il·lusió conèixer el senyor Bailey perquè va ser un agent bàsic, fonamental en aquest informe que per nosaltres ens ha donat tants arguments i aquesta centralitat de la cultura en relació a la salut. I en segon lloc apuntar que el senyor Bailey, abans d'estar a l'OMS, és una persona, aquí miro els que sou de cultura, dels nostres, diguem-ne, perquè és un actor, és algú que ha treballat des de l'àmbit artístic, cultural, des d'aquesta convicció i el seu salt, diguem-ne, va fer que es preocupés per aquest àmbit de cultura i salut. A partir, en part, i això entenc que potser ens ho explica, però a mi, investigant sobre qui era el senyor Bailey, em sembla interessant veure-ho que, i això en el debat, en el minidebat que tenien el rector i el professor, hi havia això, que he llegit una afirmació que feia el senyor Bailey que deia l'art, la cultura, no milloraran els meus problemes amb el meu nervi òptic i per tant hi ha elements que tenen a veure, evidentment, que no el resol l'art i la cultura i en el qual hem de seguir investigant des del punt de vista científic, però sí que contribuiran a que la meva vida sigui molt millor malgrat que no pugui resoldre aquesta qüestió que té una base que no té res a veure amb l'art i la cultura. Per tant, tot té un límit, evidentment, tot té un límit, però l'art i la cultura poden contribueixen a aquest benestar. Jo crec que és una persona que ho ha viscut i que a més hi ha reflexionat i que a més té l'autoritat de l'Organització Mundial de la Salut per parlar-ne. Per tant, jo crec que és un luxe i us felicito que hagueu aconseguit que el senyor Bailey estigui aquí. Moltes gràcies. Thank you. Welcome to Catalonia. Escolteu. Thank you.
We were all born in trauma. I would like you now to please close your eyes. I want you to imagine that you're in your mother's womb. You can hear her heartbeat. You can hear the gentle in and out of her lungs. You can hear the gurgling of her digestive tract. Even in the distance, you hear a low rumbling of the sound of your father's voice. These sounds, these intonations, form the basis of the symphony orchestra later in life. The sound of your mother's voice from the womb is the same tonal registry as a cello. And as you float in this universe of warmth, where all your needs are provided, you feel nothing but contentment. And then one day, literally, the world around you begins to contract. And you're confused. You don't know what's happening. There's a change. And then a disaster, a catastrophe happens. You are expelled from this perfect environment into this world of blinding light, of noise, of smells. And you are filled with these emotions that you've never felt before. You feel terror, you feel anger, you feel loss and grief. And what do you do in the surge of emotions? You scream with your entire little body. Ah! Please, scream with me. Ah! You can do better. Ah! Wah! Wah! And in that moment, where with all of your might, all of your little mass, you scream your heart out, what happens? Your lungs begin to function. They jumpstart. Your heart beats. Your cardiopulmonary system drives into action. That scream starts your life. Trauma is not always an ending. Trauma can be a birth. There is such a thing as trauma-informed growth. So what is the next thing that happens? You're screaming, you're crying, and suddenly you feel yourself placed into the arms of something warm and comforting and strangely familiar. And this thing comes down, the mother's breast touches your cheek, and your rooting instinct takes over, and your lips search to find the nipple, and you have your first drink of milk. And in that moment, your eyes, which can barely focus on anything, you only have a focal length of about 6 inches. But that 6 inches is exactly the focal length between the cradle of your mother's arms and her eyes. The one thing you can see clearly is her face. And in that moment, when you see that adoring, loving face, the eyes shining brightly with her joy that you've been born, a change happens in your midbrain. You develop the ability to create mirror neurons. You develop in that instant the ability to empathize, to feel for someone else, because in that moment, for the first time in your tiny life, you recognize that somebody else exists, and that person comforts you, feeds you, takes care of you, and somehow you also know that you're comforting her. It is that moment of connection. And we know that that moment of connection, if it's interrupted in any way, that child is statistically more likely to become sociopathic. They lose the ability to generate mirror neurons. They become impaired. For instance, a number of years ago, it was noticed in early childhood development that the incidence of sociopathic behavior was going up in the developing world. And why was that? Well, one of the causes that they identified was something very simple. The parents were so busy trying to take the selfie with the baby that they interrupted the moment between mother and child, and that midbrain change did not happen correctly. So now in most maternity wards around the world, they ban cell phones so that the attention can be focused entirely on that child. It is of vital importance. So what is the first communication between mother and child? We know. We've seen it on both ends of the spectrum. It's not words, it's baby talk. It's coo 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 coo, ga 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 ga, echoing back and forth. And the signal and response of that communication between mother and child is not words, it is song. Song, from an evolutionary perspective, predates language. Broca's area is a relatively new addition to the brain. We were singing for millennia before we actually started to form words. And when you look at the brain when it is in the midst of a musical experience, the entire brain lights up, not just Broca's area, the whole brain. And that's going to become important in a few minutes. So as the child develops and we get to the toddler stage, there's also that wonderful moment that as parents we've all recognized, where as the child is observing and processing the world and beginning to form patterns, to beginning to organize the brain through neural pruning to try and put things into categories so that we can actually start making sense of this chaotic world. One of the ways that the child will do it, and I remember just a number of months ago witnessing this firsthand in a museum where this mother was pushing this little toddler in front of a painting. It was in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the painting was that Japanese print of the wave with Mount Fuji in the background. And the child was looking at this two-dimensional object with color and suddenly recognized that it wasn't just paint on a canvas, it was a wave. And so what does the child do? The child points to it and then looks up at the mother for validation of what I just saw. Was that a wave? And then the mother, in exaggeration, says yes and smiles, and then the child laughs because it's made the association between the physical reality of a two-dimensional surface with paint on it to a symbolic conception of something that they could imagine. Every deep aesthetic experience that we have throughout our life recreates those moments. Every time we have a moment of shared attention, our mirror neurons begin to kick in, and we have literally, neurologically, a shared experience and a shared biochemical, neurological journey towards discovery. And that discovery is something that is interpreted through the filter of our own imagination, our own experience, but also the commonality of what we are experiencing together in this church, in this theater, in this sports stadium, in this park, in this living room. This reaction is part of our toolbox that evolution has developed over the millennia to help us cope with the everyday stresses of life, to help us make sense and imagine the world when we face difficulties, as we inevitably and must do in order to become stronger, in order to fulfill who we are meant to be. We have these tools at our disposal through creative expression, through common experience, to reward ourselves for these discoveries, for these transcendent moments, and fortify ourselves in the face of adversity, and if it's an adversity that overwhelms us, to find an authentic personal meaning and a sense of belonging regardless. That's the power of the arts. Now at WHO, we mentioned the 2019 report that we published a number of years ago, which is the most downloaded report on the WHO website for the last 10 years, or 7 years, 6 years. It does have biomedical results in it that are very compelling to policymakers. For instance, in a hospital setting, if you add music to physical therapy after an accident or a surgery, your recovery time in the hospital is cut by 50%. That has real-world implications. We're going to be hearing later from Daisy Fancourt, who I imagine is going to be discussing her work with large population data sets. And one of the discoveries that she made in these very large samples is that if you practice at a minimal level artistic engagement 3 to 4 times a week, your likelihood of developing depression drops by 50%. These are real-world numbers that have a huge impact on the health system and on productivity, but most importantly, on the way that we engage the world and whether or not we define ourselves as being happy or not. I could give specific examples around the world, working with in a hospital in Lagos, and how in a group of patients who are suffering from sickle cell anemia, how when they listened to music that they felt a passion for, or dance that they felt the aesthetic flow with, it actually had the ability, the dopamine in their system, to dilate their blood vessels and release the acutely painful blood dams and provide relief from that condition. There are any number of biomedical examples that I could give, but to some degree they all miss the point. Because what it really is about, it's not about the absence of disease or infirmity, it's about living your best life. It's about finding a way of achieving the highest level of physical, mental, and social well-being. And that is incomplete without communication. There's a quote from Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, that I use as a touchstone for all of my work. He said, "Loneliness is not the absence of people. Loneliness is the inability to express what matters to you most." And the arts, in all of their different facets, evolved to do exactly that. They connect each other. They connect us. So what happens, particularly when we face trauma? What is trauma? And I think one of the reasons why I'm interested in trauma is, I quote Oliver Sacks, who said, "The brain is such an elegant, complex mechanism that we never truly understand how it works until something goes wrong and then the mechanism is revealed." And trauma is a very good example of that. So I'll give an example from my own life. A number of years ago, I had cancer. I was given a 50% chance of surviving the year. Spoiler alert, I lived. But when I woke up in the hospital after an emergency operation, I had this sensation that many people who have experienced forms of trauma have had as well. And that trauma could be an operation like I had, or it could be you've been the victim of physical violence from somebody, or an accident, or emotional violence. It's any form of trauma, really. I had this experience of floating on the ceiling, looking down on my body on the hospital bed, as if my spirit had fled because my body was no longer a safe place to be. That actually has a neurological reason. When we face a danger or a conflict, there are certain reflexes that kick in. When the danger is far enough away, we may become alert, our adrenaline goes up, our cortisol levels go up to prepare us for a flight or flight instinct, but we have that moment where we can plan, we can think about it, we can try and manage or cope with it, but when that threat becomes too imminent, we go into fight or flight mode. We either attack or we run away. That's the lizard brain takes over. We're no longer thinking. It shuts down the frontal cortex. And if that fails, and the violence is imminent, perhaps death, evolution has given us a cheat code of going into shock. We're literally playing dead, and that gives us a small evolutionary advantage that perhaps the predator will pass us over. The problem with it is that once you go into shock and you have that state of extreme disassociation, it's extremely hard to reassemble that. Your sense of proprioception becomes disrupted. What is proprioception? Aristotle said there were 5 senses. We've actually counted close to a dozen. One of them is proprioception. It's the ability of your mind to map to your own body, to feel a sense of ownership of your body, to map to relationships, to each other, to feel a sense of connection with each other, to the landscape, to the world around you, even our notion of time. And when we go into shock, we lose that proprioception. On the positive side, if you want to test whether you have proprioception, take your hand and put it out of eyesight, and if you have a sense of where it is without being able to see it, your proprioception is working fine. Oliver Sacks again described the loss of proprioception in a book called A Leg to Stand On. He was hiking in Norway in the mountains, and he had this terrible accident that shattered his leg. And after 6 months of physical therapy and rehabilitation, his leg was perfectly fine, but he had this morbid sensation that that leg was no longer part of his body. His sense of proprioception was still off. He could not map to it to make it a part of him. And one of the ways he did it was actually through the music of Mendelssohn. That helped repair that damage. So here I am back in the hospital, floating over my body, and what happened next? I looked out the window and I saw a tree with green leaves, and it was a sign of life. And I focused on that. I saw an image on the wall of a painting, and my imagination began to play with it, and it became a connection to this place, this moment, this experience. And then the surgeon came in, and I was so filled with morphine, I had no idea what he was saying. It was just blah, 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 blah. But while he was talking and explaining what had happened, he took his hand, and his palm touched my shoulder. And that physical connection, that warmth of his palm against my skin, was almost a tether to coax my spirit back into my body as a safe place to be. Why does this work? Well, part of it is the biochemical reaction. When I've worked with groups on transgenerational trauma, for instance, in Ireland after the Troubles, one of the effective means that they found was to interrupt the cycle of transgenerational trauma was exposure to the landscape, to a seaside, to a vista of mountains or something intensely beautiful. What happens when you're exposed to something incredibly beautiful? Well, if you're in a dissociated state, you don't feel connected to anything, but suddenly you look around and you see the mountains, you hear the sirens in the street, you feel yourself part of a larger world. And instead of feeling diminished, you feel that you're a small but essential part of that larger whole. And the hormonal reward you get for that connection is a shot of oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. It literally helps you reconnect. It helps you restart your sense of proprioception. Instead of being dissociated, you literally become associated again. It's not instantaneous. It happens over time. So, last year, I worked extensively in Ukraine, in a place with a group called the Unbroken Project in the Lviv hospital system. And I was working with former prisoners of war. They come to the hospital after the infrequent exchanges with the Russian side, and oftentimes they come in a state of complete psychosis. I have the MRIs on my phone showing the brain scans where there is zero activity in their frontal cortex. They have no conception of self. They are in a total psychotic state, and judging by the physical evidence on their bodies, they have been subjected to unimaginable torture for 6 months or more on a regular basis, which has entirely shut down their brain. Traditional talk therapy is totally ineffective. It triggers a flashback to the moment of torture and a psychotic state. Pharmaceutical interventions, antipsychotic drugs, antidepressants, opiates, could calm the patient and allow them to sleep, but did nothing to restart the brain activity in the frontal cortex. The only thing that worked was art therapy, and within 6 weeks, brain activity returned to within a normal range. This is the power of arts and creative expression to rebuild those connections. And sometimes it's at a very concrete physical level that you can map with the MRI. There was last year I was in in a refugee camp near Abuja, also in Nigeria. And I was amazed at the work they were doing with the arts, with all the various people coming for different reasons, from the flooding in the north, from civil conflict in the northwest, a whole variety of experiences of why people were expelled from their home, from their homeland, and all sorts of different fears and anxieties that they were bringing with them, and how dance and music and the arts were helping them process what had happened, but also imagine a better future. And I asked them, totally impressed with their work, a question that I ask in any clinical setting or any community center setting. I said, what are the major health issues that you have to deal with? And without skipping a beat, in unison, they all said, witchcraft. And I said, okay, can you explain that a little more so that I can understand what you mean by that? And they said, well, for instance, there's a man over the hill who's under a spell. And I said, is it okay if we talk to him so I can look at him and see what kind of a spell he's under? And they said, sure. So we went, and I saw this elderly gentleman, his face contorted, muttering, shouting out expletives. He was in distress, but I could tell from my own experience with my father-in-law and working with similar patients that he had dementia. And so I asked if there was anyone in the group that knew him, and one woman said, well, I'm from the same village that he's from. And I said, do you think you would know a song that he would know from his childhood? And she said, I think so. I said, could you sing it? And so she sang the song. The crickets, they sing, the crickets sing all day, all day, all day. And he listened, and he looked at her, and he looked at the others, and he began to recognize them, and he remembered the song, and he sang the next verse, and for a few minutes, he actually could remember who he was, where he was, and who these relationships were. And then the crowd turned to me and said, "Are you a witch?" And I said, "No, I'm from the World Health Organization. He's suffering from something called Alzheimer's disease. And because music is this all-brain experience, during that musical moment, the neural pathways can take detours around the damaged areas and temporarily reconnect, giving you a glimpse of the person you thought you had lost and giving them a glimpse of the world that they thought they had lost." And I said that the effect is not permanent. It only lasts for a few minutes. The damage is still there. And they said, "So what should we do?" And I said, "You need to bring him back into the community, feed him, take care of him, and sing to him 3 times a day." Now, sometimes it actually can be therapeutic. If I've suffered a stroke and it's affected Broca's area and I've lost the ability to speak, I may not have lost the ability to sing. And there is a specific therapy with this type of stroke where if you sing what you want, what you mean to say, you can, over time, begin to flatten out that melodic capability into singing a monotone and begin to simulate speech. And literally your brain begins to use its neuroplasticity to lay down new neural pathways to create an ability to speak that's outside of the damaged area that prevented you from speaking. So there are therapeutic approaches to it, but most importantly, it's not even the curing aspect that gives value to this. It's people recognizing that their affliction, their disability, is not the end of the story, that they can adapt, they can transcend, they can find meaning in it, they can own the person that they're about to become. And that's the transformative power of the arts. So, in my own case, when I lost my sight, my arts and health program was booming. We were discovering all these fascinating biomedical reasons why it was working so well. There was this global movement of ministries around the world asking for guidance in terms of policy of how to implement this in a health system way and in a sustainable way. It was completely taking off, and the more I began to learn about the aspects of how this could be beneficial to both individuals and groups of people, to communities, how we could support our fundamental need to find individual authentic meaning in our lives and collective meaning and a sense of belonging as an essential part of being a complete person, not just the absence of disease, but being a complete human. I felt there was nothing in this bag of tricks for me. There was nothing in any of the arts that could regenerate my shattered optic nerve. And so in our modern society, 80% of the way we engage with the world is visual. And I found myself feeling exiled from the world, cast out, pariah. And as much as I put on a good face and did my work, it was almost as if the food of life had no flavor anymore. When I see the world, it's like through a dirty gauze. I do not see colors. I do not see detail. Things pop in and out. It's like walking through a minefield. And I learned to cope with the assistive technology. My brain did transform. I learned the ability to echolocate, of using sound in my visual cortex to try and get a physical picture of the room based on how the sound can pass through your body, through the walls. And it doesn't replace sight, but it gives me at least a tool to be able to navigate this strange and dangerous place that I've now found myself in. But it didn't give me a sense of beauty. And one day I was supposed to report on this grant that I'd received from the Wellcome Trust. I'm in London, and I did something that I often do. I took a walk before going to this event, And I saw that there was a concert at St. Martin in the Fields, and a midday concert which I wanted to hear. And I'm walking through Trafalgar Square, and it was packed with people. And I found myself getting buffeted about. My heart began to race. I began to sweat, and I realized I was having a panic attack. I found myself cast away in the sea of humanity, buffeted about, disoriented, and eventually washed ashore on the wrong side of the square in front of the National Gallery. And I looked up and I saw this museum. And I hadn't been to a museum in years because it had given me such pleasure I couldn't bear to face a place where I had enjoyed beauty so much, and now it was deprived from me. But to escape the crowd, I go in anyway, and I find myself in this gallery of these monumental paintings, and I'm looking at them trying to figure out what they were. And I see fog, I see seascapes, I see rain, I see ships, and I realized I was in the Turner wind. And suddenly, I tasted on my cheek salt water. And I thought, is this from the mist of the seascape in the painting? No, it was a tear streaming down my cheek, because in that moment, I was seeing that the way Turner saw the world, this long-dead artist and the object he created, with his mist and his fog, was identical to the way I see the world. And for the first time, I could imagine that the way I see the world could be considered beautiful. Just as you willingly close your eyes to better savor a glass of red wine. Just as you willingly close your eyes to better embody a beautiful piece of music. Just as you willingly close your eyes to trace the gentle slope of a lover's forearm, so too do I now accept the closing of my eyes to better share this moment with you. Thank you.